Jill, I don't see record.
It's recording.
Oh, it is good.
I can see it says the button. If we press the button now, we
Oh,
will
I see
stop
the session
recording.
is being recorded.
I think we're good.
Welcome all of you. We will be starting in a minute or two. It's a little bit before 1 o'clock, and thank you all for joining us. Well, I have 1 o'clock, so 1 o'clock Eastern time here in DC, or in my case, suburban DC, Rockville, Maryland. I know that some attendees are still joining, but do want to begin. Thank you all for being here. I'm David Weinstein. My colleague from the Division of Public Programs, Jill Austin, is also on the call, and you'll meet her later during the question and answer. I want to thank you all for being here. We're here to talk about NEH Media Project grants. You'll notice in the chat box there are links for live captioning, so please feel free to use those. So we're going to start with brief introduction or an overview of NEH and the Public Programs Division. Then we'll talk about short documentaries, media projects. Then we'll provide some news and tips and questions. So we'll talk about the 2 different grant programs, short docs and media projects a little bit later. But first I want to start with a little bit of an overview about what the NEH does and what Public Programs does. We'll leave plenty of time for your questions at the end. Please put your questions in the questions box, not the chat box. Also, if you're having any technical issues, please put them in questions, not chat. And again, we do in the chat have the live captioning link if you would like to use that. Thank you. The NEH is a federal government agency, so in giving grants, these are really your tax dollars at work. We were established in 1965, and that's a photo from when our founding legislation was signed. Our chairman is John Parrish, PD, and we're organized by division. There are a total of 7 divisions that I'll tell you about in a minute. And the divisions themselves are organized largely based on audience and grant product. When we talk about the humanities, we're talking about subjects, but we're also talking about approaches. What I mean by that is the approach must be scholarly. And it must incorporate scholarship. But we are also talking about humanities disciplines, such as history, literature, philosophy, media history, for example, film or media studies. There are numerous humanities disciplines, and the best way to get a sense of what we're looking for and what we mean when we talk about the humanities is to visit our website at NEH.gov, where you'll find a good definition of the humanities from the NEH's perspective. The Division of Public Programs is my division, and we're one of 7 NEH divisions and offices. In general, the divisions and offices are organized by audience as well as grant product. So, for example, a research division supports scholarly research projects. Education division supports a range of activities, especially for educators and teacher training. Our division supports projects for the general public. And they bring some of the research, some of the scholarship from the other NEH divisions to public audiences. So projects must be analytical and they must be based in humanities scholarship. We have 4 different grant programs in the Division of Public Programs, and you'll notice that we fund a variety of formats, and each grant program funds a slightly different type of project or a slightly different format. We have a grant program called Digital Projects for the Public with an annual deadline in June, and that funds what we think of as digital projects, websites, mobile apps, walking tours, games, interactive kiosks, museums especially. We funded some virtual reality, augmented reality, so that's all part of digital projects for the public. Media projects, which I'll be talking about, are long-form documentaries, radio programs, podcasts. Public humanities projects is a separate grant program, also with an August deadline. Funds museums, historic site interpretations, and humanities discussion programs. And then short documentaries, which we'll be talking about in a little while, funds, as it sounds like, short documentaries, single programs or series, and I'll talk about a more perfect union in a couple minutes. So the focus today is really on 3 programs related to media production: short documentaries, media project development, and media production. The first category that I'd like to talk about is short documentaries. These can be either for single films up to 30 minutes or a series of short films up to 30 minutes. We also fund related website, we fund outreach and engagement, we fund distribution through this. We recently raised the funding levels for the August deadline. We will fund up to $150,000 for a single film, up to $300,000 for a series of films, each up to 30 minutes. We only fund production in short documentaries. We don't fund development, and I'll talk about the distinction between those categories in a minute. And short documentaries is different from media in a couple of ways, but one way that it's different is that short documentaries must be related to a more perfect union. What is a more perfect union, you may ask? That is a new initiative at the NEH commemorating the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States, which will take place in 2026. It does not have to be colonial history. We are looking for a broad range of diverse topics in American history and culture, including projects that look at civic values or democracy, but also prominent figures in American history and culture. The films, if you're doing a film or a podcast, would not have to premiere in 2026. It can premiere earlier, it can premiere later, but it is tied to this idea that this is a good time to look back on American history and culture. And again, it doesn't have to be colonial history necessarily, although it certainly can be. Media projects is separate from short documentaries, and it funds films longer than 30 minutes. We also fund radio, podcasts, related websites, outreach and distribution, all under media. So it's not just film and it's long form. We have two categories of media grants, and I'll tell you more about each one in a minute. Development, which funds a script or detailed treatment, and that's what we think of as the earlier phase. Sometimes if people are new to NEH, they'll come in for development and try to get some funds that they could then use to get the project off the ground or advance it, and also to potentially come in for production. Production are the bigger money grants, and they're to actually produce and distribute your film or audio project. We have two deadlines that we'll talk about. You do not, one in August, one in January. You do not need to have received a development grant in order to apply for production. You can come right in for production if you want. You could also come in for development and decide that you don't want to come in for production or apply for production at NEH, and that's okay. Let's move on to discuss the specific funding levels a little bit more. Development grants fund up to are available for up to $75,000. It's to develop a single film or a series of films. I mentioned earlier that we don't fund development of individual short films. However, a series of short films may apply to us under development, as could, of course, a long form series. Even at development, we do require a fair amount of work to be sure that the project really fits the NEH's mission. We require what we call media and scholarly teams. The media teams is the team of people who will be producing the film. At development, it's especially important to have a director and a writer on board. You don't necessarily have to name a cinematographer, an editor, or some of those slots or positions. It's also important to have a scholarly team on board. This goes across the board for all of our divisions grants. A scholarly team is a team of advisors with scholarly expertise on the subject, who can really make sure that your film or radio program, audio program, has the best and most recent scholarship, and that it's incorporating that into your story and into your film or radio program. We also require humanities themes, and humanities themes are what distinguish the NEH from most other film and radio funders. So I want to tell you a little bit more about what that means. Humanities themes are ideas about the humanities, or what viewers or listeners will eventually learn about the humanities from your project. They frequently incorporate some scholarship, and their ideas or even arguments about the subject that you want to put forward. Why the figure, that if it's a biography, for example, why the figure was important, how the figure fits into a broader history. You would use the humanities theme section to talk about that, frequently bulleting them into 3 or 4 key themes or ideas and then explaining those themes. We also require a draft treatment of up to 5 pages, and that's giving us a sense of the story and starting to show how the humanities themes will be incorporated. So even at the development stage, we do require a fair amount of work, and sometimes the term development in development grant throws people off a little bit, because again, it's not for the very earliest, I have an idea and I want to do a film level of development. You need to have done a certain amount of work to truly be competitive with the NEH development proposal. And activities, as I suggested, under a development grant may include meetings with scholars, conducting preliminary interviews. We also allow the production of a, quote, sizzle reel or a work in progress or trailer under a development grant, and you can start to create partnerships for outreach. So you can do what you need to do to really move the project forward in terms of filmmaking, partnerships, and also in terms of scholarship with the development grant. Production grants are the big money grant. We raise the funding level for production grants. They're now $700,000 max. They used to be $650,000. And prerequisites are the kind of work that you might do with the development grant or even on your own. You need to have done a significant amount of research. You need to have your scholarly themes, media teams, scholarly teams all set. The treatment is longer, 15 pages per hour. We used to have significantly longer requirements for development and production, and we're tightening those. So 15 pages an hour is a lot, but again, it's not as much as it used to be, and applicants are able to do that. Really, for production, walking through the details of how the story is going to develop, sometimes in a script, even anticipating the way the dialogue is going to go based on your research. And during the Q&A, if you'd like, Jill and I can talk a little bit more about what that might mean or what we're looking for in a script. You can also develop your fundraising plan. Even at the time of production, you need to have a fundraising and distribution plan in place. That doesn't mean you need to have distribution agreements signed, but you need to have a good argument as to how you're going to distribute the film and how the public is going to see it. And in both levels, development and production, we require a sample of previous work. We don't require a work in progress or a trailer for production, but applicants frequently decide to submit those in addition to a completed work sample from a previous work. And again, for production grant, you're doing everything that you need to do to shoot a film, edit a film, distribute a film, and even evaluate a film, including a related website. Let me give you examples of some of the films that we have funded. And our website has a tremendous amount of information about what we funded from over the last several years, in addition to some samples of successful projects, but I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. We have funded a range of biographies. One, I don't know if any of you had a chance to see a terrific film. I mean, all of these films are really terrific. I really enjoyed them and proud that the NEH got behind them. The Worlds of Ursula K. Le Guin, biography of the science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin. The Loving Story, which I put because it aired on HBO. It did not air on public television. And more our films are distributed through various pay services, streaming services, and theatrical, as long as they get a significant audience. We do not require public television distribution. The Loving Story became the basis also for a Hollywood film, which is nice and which I wanted to point out. And it's the story about the landmark Supreme Court case and the couple behind it that eventually legalized interracial marriage. And Adios Amor is a biography of Maria Moreno, a prominent labor organizer whose story had been lost to history until this NEH-funded film by Laurie Coyle. Not all of our funds are biographies, so I wanted to give you examples of additional independent films from independent producers that are not biographies. Hillbilly, if any of you saw that, it's about the images of white Southerners in the media, and it even touches on contemporary interviews and contemporary life in Appalachia. It's not strictly historical, it moves between the past and the present, but it is scholarly. Who Will Write Our History is an international film about the Warsaw Ghetto. And I include that because we do fund international projects. It does not have to be US based in order to be competitive, or US story in order to be competitive at the NEH. We also funded Mr. Soul, which is a recent film about Ellis Hazlitt and his TV program Soul. And it's also a cultural history, really, of African-American life and culture during the late 60s and early 70s. And we do fund pop culture projects. People don't necessarily think of NEH and pop culture, but we do fund cultural history. We also have funded a range of radio programs and podcasts. Most are distributed through public radio, but they have had different distributors, especially for podcasts, as the distribution strategies and networks have changed. But you would still need to make an argument that you have a strong distribution strategy as you put forward your application. Let me shift now to talk a little bit about the application review process. When applications come in, staff reviews them for eligibility, and we convene a series of peer review panels. We're always looking for panelists, so you can email me or Jill or both of us if you think that you might be interested in serving as a panelist, which is a really good way to get a sense of how the NEH works and at least part of the decision process and what that entails. So peer review panels are usually a combination of what we call media practitioners, producers, directors, station people, in some cases executives, and scholars. They come together, usually online, and review the proposals. We'll convene several panels per deadline. So it's not like The network connection may be too close. Uh-oh. Getting a network connection thing that we'll ignore for now and hope for the best. After the peer review panel, the National Council on the Humanities meets. We make recommendations, staff makes recommendations to the National Council. This is a distinguished board of 26 people appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate on a rotating 6-year basis. And the National Council on the Humanities ultimately makes recommendations to the NEH chairman, in this case, Chairman Peedy, and Chairman Peedy alone makes final funding decisions. The process takes several months. It has multiple stages, but we think it's important to have those multiple perspectives in there. As far as tips, one question that we get is, what does a successful proposal look like? And the overriding point that I want to make here is that a proposal is something of a sales document, and that you want the people who read it to really get a good handle on it and really get excited about your project. It helps a lot if you have a significant and appealing subject. If people think we really want to see a film about X. For the NEH, the scholarship and the humanities teams are really important. The media team is really important also. But the storytelling is important, and sometimes when people apply to NEH, they forget that. Scholarship is central to us, but you need to convince us that it'll be a good story and a story that people will want to see and a story that will get distributed. As far as additional tips, we always urge people to visit our website. The link is over there, and you could just Google NEH Public Programs and it will come up. We put a tremendous amount of information up there to help potential applicants and grantees. NOFO is the Notice of Funding Opportunity. We used to call that guidelines, but we call it NOFO now. But it is a very detailed document telling you exactly what we're looking for in a successful application. We have samples of applications that have been funded. Some information has been redacted for privacy reasons, but there's still a lot of information to give you a sense of the format and the formula for an NEH proposal and what you would need to do. We have additional resources such as lists of funded projects, and that's all at our website. And that's usually the first thing that I recommend people do, potential applicants do, to really spend some time looking at all of these documents to decide if they want to move forward with an NEH application. There are some nuts and bolts things that you should also be aware of. If you're an independent filmmaker with a for-profit organization, you will need to partner with an eligible organization. I'm not going to go through all the eligibility requirements now, but in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, we do list them. We also recommend that you register early with the various entities that you'll need to register with in order to submit the application. And when I say you, I really mean the organization that you're partnering with if you're an independent filmmaker or radio producer to submit the application. And again, the Notice of Funding Opportunity has the information, but my point here is to register early. I told you a little bit about the panel. It's a combination of scholars and media professionals. So write for them, if you're a filmmaker or radio producer, write for somebody like you, but also keep in mind that scholars will be reviewing the application. Scholars have to, be on board with being excited about the project. It's always a good idea to have other people read the application and not just proofread, to get a sense, is this exciting, is this interesting, and does this satisfy the NEH's requirements? Again, review the NOFO carefully, NOFO being the guidelines. And once you've done that, contact NEH staff. We're happy to speak with potential applicants. We can review drafts. Unfortunately, we have a hard deadline of 5 weeks before the proposals are due, which is right around now in terms of draft review. So it's probably too late for us to review a written draft at this point for those of you who have not begun to do the application, but we can read all part of a draft for a future deadline, or just so you know about that. We really do want to work with applicants. The next deadline is approaching. It's August 12th, and we also accept applications in January, so that'll be January of next year. And I think we're ready to take some questions. I thank you all for your attention. And let me keep this slide up for a minute. It has my information, my colleague Jill's information in the Division of Public Programs. You can write to any of these with questions or for guidance on your application. Jill or I are happy to help you, or the division general box will get you to a program officer. And I thank you. So at this point, I'm going to stop. I'll leave this up for a minute or two, and we can see if there are any questions. If you have questions, just go ahead and type them in the questions box.
Hi, everyone. This is Jill Austin. I'll just jump in here, David. We've had a few questions come in, and for those of you who are registered online, I've been trying to answer the short ones within the question box, and I've made them available to everyone. And one of the most popular questions is whether or not the slides will be available after the presentation. And so we are attempting to record. Sometimes there are technical glitches. We hope that this is a successful recording, and so that will be available. There is an email follow-up that will go out to you. I believe it's set for 3 days after this presentation. If the recording should not work out and you would like to request a set of the slides, you could email me or David through our email contacts and request those visuals. David, one of the interesting questions that came in is regarding YouTube. Can a media projects grant be used for a series of YouTube videos rather than a film, or would those fall under short docs?
That's a really good question. I mean, but there are really a couple of questions. One is about distribution and the other one is about length. As far as length, it would depend how long each episode is. Again, 30 minutes or shorter would go to short docs, longer would go to media. The next question really is about distribution, and that's tricky because even with YouTube, you would want to show that you have a distribution plan in place to draw attention to it. Depending on where you're hosting it, even on YouTube, if it's part of a channel, for example, or if it's part of a network of YouTubers or something where there's going to be traffic driven towards it. We get the question a lot about podcasts also, where it's relatively inexpensive and relatively easy to post a podcast and even put it on the major distribution platforms. But as far as really drawing attention to it, there are so many podcasts out there. The key in the NEH application would be to demonstrate that you have the partnerships necessary to really promote it, really get the word out so it doesn't just get lost amidst the sea of media in which we're all swimming, if you pardon a lousy metaphor.
Here's one, for podcasts, are you only able to apply for podcasts under narrative productions? I think that this may be media productions or implementation perhaps. This person's project is mainly conversations based with established guests.
You could certainly apply in media for a discussion or a conversation program, and we have funded a few of those, so it would go to media. The challenge with that is similar to the challenge that I had mentioned, I think, in talking a little bit about YouTube, that you would still want to show amidst all of, the many discussion programs that in some way you have the network to really promote it. There's something special about your program, or maybe even the host, that not only is there a following, but that you're doing something that is both firmly in the humanities and really significant. We've also funded programs like Backstory, which recently ended, which sort of a hybrid where it started off with 3 historians talking about history, and more they started to do more packaged pieces that they intersperse with the podcast, and those have been effective. So I can think of a few strictly talk programs that we funded, but If there's some way that you can demonstrate that there's something more or an added value to your particular program and that it's central to the humanities, that could help. The other challenge is that we do require a fair amount of information up front about the content. So it wouldn't really be enough to just say, well, these are the 8 people that we're going to interview over the next season. We want $250,000, $300,000 for it. We do want a decent sense of what the content will be. And for strictly an interview program, that could be a little bit tougher than it might be for something where you're going back, where you're with history, for example, you know the story, or where you really have a sense of what the content's going to be, how it's going to develop, and how it's in the humanities versus, well, we want to talk to this historian and we're sure it'll be great. And that's not always possible. There are some terrific shows that need to be timely and don't work with that much advance time, and those can be tricky to apply to NEH for, even though it can be really great also, just not necessarily for NEH.
Here's a question that I know, David, you are way more knowledgeable about than I am, and this is back to that fiscal sponsor question. If you so this person has written, I saw that you cannot use a fiscal sponsor, but what if your fiscal sponsor is a true partner in terms of outreach activities, organizing the scholars, and really being involved with the distribution? That can be tricky.
Yeah, we added some language about fiscal sponsors fairly recently. The fiscal sponsor is the organization that you're working with that actually is the official grantee. What I mean by that is if you're an independent producer and you want to apply to NEH, you need to find an organization, and we have the eligibility requirements in our guidelines, but most important one, it's a 501c3 that you're going to work with to submit the application. And we use terms like partnership, but we don't really define it. We don't want a fiscal sponsor that basically collects NEH money and gives it right to the filmmaker without being involved in the project, without really knowing what's going on, and without doing something to work with the filmmaker, who we also call the project director. So the exact relationship is, we don't really define the exact relationship. Sometimes fiscal sponsors help with fundraising. They're usually involved enough in the production that they understand what you're doing as a filmmaker, why you would need the funds, and they guide you and they help you, again, as the grantee and the ones who ultimately have to report to NEH. So we didn't want a hands-off fiscal sponsor that isn't doing as much with the project. So, but the relationship has to work for both you and the fiscal sponsor, and you can negotiate that, but they are partners with it, and they're the ones who are ultimately responsible for the funds, and we wanted to signal that. Would you have anything else to add, Jill, about that, or no?
No, that's perfect. Here's one that I've never seen this question before. So this is about international themes and international broadcast, possibly. So I'm just going to read this one. For projects focused on international themes, will a distribution plan that includes international broadcast opportunities be considered along with national broadcast distribution opportunities?
That's a good question about international distribution. As a U.S. taxpayer-funded government organization, our focus is really getting the best humanities content to the American U.S. public. It doesn't hurt if you have an international distribution agreement or plan lined up. And sometimes, you know, it's nice when NEH-funded films are shown abroad, and we've had partnerships with the State Department to show films. But as far as our criteria, we really are focused on the U.S. audience and U.S. distribution and how the American public is ultimately going to be able to access and enjoy the grant product.
Great. There's a question here about the writing samples, and as David also mentioned, our landing page includes some very helpful writing samples that include those for development as well as production. And so there's a question here. Someone's been looking at them and making good use of them, which is great, but is wondering about the different page counts, and these seem older. And so the question is, just to let everyone know, you should take those samples with a grain of salt, because they are recent, funded within the past few years typically, but they were all written according to different sets of guidelines or NOFOs. And so the different requirements may have been different, may have appeared in different parts of the guidelines or the order of the contents. So each of those applicants was writing according to that particular deadline's set of guidelines, the order and the requirements. So you should never follow those absolutely. Always follow the guidelines for the current deadline that you're applying to, but it's very, very helpful to see how an applicant has made a strong argument, has really discussed and developed the themes, the humanities themes, and is really making that case for funding. And those samples we put up there to really provide that model of imagining a strong case for the proposal, and then knowing that it has been funded and has come to life. So those really do represent strong and successful proposals from us, but follow those guidelines. Just really use them as inspiration.
Yeah, that's a great advice, Jill, and great tips. The one or two points that I would highlight, they all have humanities theme sections, and that's the trickiest part for media producers to figure out how to put together. So I would look at the humanities themes. Don't take as Jill suggested, don't take the page number count too literally, because they were written for other guidelines, but look at humanities themes. And the other question that we frequently get is, how do you write a treatment or a script? And even though some of those samples were written for older guidelines with the longer page or higher page limit, you could at least get a sense of how previously successful applicants put together a script or a treatment. So it's, as Jill said, it's a guide, but that's how I would use it if I were an applicant, and the other sections also, as Jill suggested.
Here's a good one, again, about licensing and distribution. Once the project is completed, is NEH involved in the licensing deal terms and profits with a distributor or a network or a streaming service such as HBO or Netflix or PBS? Are the licensing profits shared with NEH, or do they go directly to the filmmakers or producers?
That's a great question. We have information on our website. The short version is it depends in some cases on when the money has come in. If you get the money while you're in production and you need it for finishing funds or to make the film, then it's usually counted one way. If afterwards you start to make money from the film through distribution, through ancillaries, through whatever, the NEH does claim a portion of the profits. And that's, again, you can look up program income requirements on our website under grant management, and that will give you more detail. I think, and this is just off the top of my head, so don't quote me, but I think the filmmaker or the radio producer keeps something like the first $50,000, and then after that pays a portion back to the government based on the percentage of the overall funding that the NEH contributed. So if we contributed 20% of the overall budget through the grant, I think that the filmmaker would then repay something like half of that, 10%, until the grant amount is repaid. The idea being that this was a government grant and filmmakers shouldn't make huge profits from it. But again, this is a legalistic question that I'm trying to answer off the top of my head, so you can find more information under the program income requirement on our guidelines, and don't trust that more than what I'm telling you right now.
Here's a short question. Can team members be cross-organizational? I would say the short answer is yes, and that we really do include a diverse mix of people bringing different perspectives, different expertises to the project. Do you have anything to add to that, David?
No. I think that's a
Okay.
great answer.
A kind of related question, if I understand it correctly, do you think it's best that the project director in the application be different from the doc producer? Are persons holding more than one title for the production allowed?
Uh, the film director is frequently the project director. The project director is listed on the application at the top, who is the project director. And they become the main contact for me and for Jill as program officers when we want an update as to what's going on with the project. So frequently for a film, that's the film director who really knows what's going on, what the status of the production is, who's with the project from beginning to end and is really centrally involved. So that's who's usually named as the project director. That person can also be the film's director, or can and usually does have multiple roles or responsibilities. Sometimes it's an executive producer or a producer, so that person would be listed as project director and producer. But again, it's the person who will know most about the production, who I can pick up the phone and call, or Jill can pick up the phone and call and say, hey, what's going on with the project?
Great, thank you. Here's a good question, which I think you may have broached on, but I think someone here is asking for a bit more elaboration. Can you provide NEH's definition of what an established media team looks like? Should team members have already produced a documentary that was distributed nationally?
That's a really good question. One of the challenges is that it's competitive. I mean, our funding ratios are about between 10 and 15%. It varies from deadline to deadline and year to year. But that means 80, 85% of the projects are not getting funded. And since it's competitive, the experience of the media team matters. If you've done some films and they've been out on the festival circuit and they've gotten good distribution, that could be okay. We don't sit there with the checklist, national distribution, not national distribution. So if you've done some films that have gotten a lot of buzz and are really terrific, that could be good enough to get you funding, especially in short documentaries, partially because the short documentaries field is so new and there aren't a ton of producers who have national experience producing short humanities documentaries. That's one of the reasons why we created the grant program, to try to jumpstart that particular sector. At the same time, if your application is next to somebody who is very experienced, who has done a high budget production along the lines of what might be proposed, and who has a really terrific sample, that person is going to have an advantage. So one thing that you might do is try to partner, if you don't have that level of experience of those credentials, partner with somebody, an individual, an organization that does. And it's not just a matter of, well, it'll look better on an NEH application. We really do think that experience matters in documentary film and the type of documentary film that NEH wants to fund. That they're complicated. They involve lots of people. They involve lots of potential partners with distribution, scholars. It's a pretty big endeavor, and we want somebody who has successfully produced, if not an NEH funded kind of film, that a film of that level that's really good, that has achieved broad distribution, which we don't define as it must be on PBS or it must be on HBO. But applicants with that kind of experience do have an edge. So it's incumbent upon you, if you don't feel like you have that experience, to try to partner as best you can with people who do. And it might be a co-producer or director, it might be cinematographers and editors or something like that, but that's what I would suggest.
Great. Here's a question about strategy in the amount that you're requesting for your grant. So does it matter if you're asking for a kind of pie in the sky, kind of going for the maximum, does that make everything more competitive? If you were, let's say, to really, really hone in on an exact amount that you really need, does that appear to come across as a greater need, or more sincere, or more real? If you ask for a lower amount, maybe a more modest amount, does that increase your chances of getting awarded?
I'd be interested in your take, Jill. My first sense is that it's really important to be accurate with your budget. If you only need $150,000, even though the production grant is up to $750,000, I would apply for that. It doesn't mean that we think, oh, it's only 150, and I use that. Only 150 is a lot of money, I know, but we don't say, oh, they're not asking for that much. We should, the NEH should give it to them. But I say that because if there's truly a need for $150,000 and there's a budget that seems to request more, panelists or staff or other reviewers down the line will start to wonder, are they trying to take advantage a little bit? So I guess my best advice is present an accurate budget. And if you really do need $700,000 to do this film the way the NEH would want you to do it, as you see in the guidelines and other films that have been funded, request 750. If you've gotten a lot of other funding and you need essentially finishing funds, but you still feel like it's a strong humanities film, or you have other funders and you need 150 from NEH because you've gotten funding from other sources, then the budget should reflect that. Jill, would you have anything to add, or any other thoughts on that?
No, I think
Yeah.
that sounds really good. I think that if you have a specific budget, it does stand out, because it's not just that top award amount. But I think that the review is the same. We review everyone's proposal very closely. The grants office does, the accounting office does as well. So if there are any questions that arise, if you should be awarded, the grants office will contact you. Let's see. Oh, here's an interesting question. I've never thought about this one before. Let's say you got an NEH grant, you produced the project, it's been distributed. Can the filmmaker repurpose some of that original footage to put toward future projects? Or is that footage only to be used toward the originally NEH funded piece?
The filmmaker could absolutely, once you get the grant, you can do what you want with additional footage. Sometimes people have put together websites or other kinds of projects. Where it might potentially get a little bit tricky is if you came into the NEH for funding, and there might be questions of what we call informally double dipping, whether or not we already paid for something, and whether or not you would be asking for funds to essentially do work that you've already done or should have already done. So you would want to make that clear in a subsequent application to the NEH. I have all this additional footage that I shot and I want some funding to edit it into a website, and we're also going to add additional material, would be an acceptable use if you wanted to come back to NEH. You could do whatever you wanted with it if you didn't want to come back to NEH, as long as you did what you said you would do for the NEH, meaning produce the film.
Here's a question related to something that I had answered separately while you were talking earlier, David. People are asking, and we've had this question before, and I think it's something we have even fantasized about, kind of clearinghouse for people to do some project matchmaking of sorts. Is there, someone was asking if there is a resource where people can come together, scholars, creatives, looking to match up, for a project. And I said, unfortunately, we don't have that available through official means. And so someone was asking, what's the best way to really connect? Is it, if you're a creative person, how do you reach out to scholars if that seems overwhelming or you don't quite know where to start?
Yeah, again, we've talked about that and thought about that at different times because we realize that there is a need. I think it's a matter of networking, and I know that's not an ideal answer. Sometimes in speaking to a program officer, Jill or I or one of our colleagues can offer some suggestions, and it might not be a particular person. Sometimes I will mention several people as possibilities. We don't want it to be like there's an approved NEH list, and that has been one of the impediments as we've talked about what we might be able to do in terms of matchmaking. But getting back to your question, I would look at if you were looking for a filmmaking partner, I would look at the projects that we have funded and work backwards. And if there's a film that you really liked or a producer or director that you really like, contact that person. And as far as the scholarship, it's probably a matter of starting off doing a little bit of research and finding one or two scholars and then networking through them once they're interested in your project. I read your book. I think it's really great. I'm a filmmaker. Could I talk to you for a few minutes about X? And from there, starting to network and tell them what you need and tell them about a potential NEH application. Those seem to be the most successful strategies. Would you agree, Jill? Or
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. How about bilingual projects or Spanish language films? Can the product be in Spanish? My short take on this is that it must also be in English.
yeah, and I think that we have language about that somewhere in our guidelines, partially for review purposes. We are not set up to review multilingual proposals at this point. So the proposal itself would need to at least have an English version in it so that we can review it given our review process. And we have funded films in English and other languages or with subtitles, but they would need to be in some way in English at least for part of it, given the way we're set up to review, fund, and ultimately monitor projects.
Here's a question mainly about outreach and public engagement. What if the production of the film is nearly complete and you're looking for funding for the outreach programs and public program activities? You can apply for such support within your production proposal. At the same time, though, if it's really at the point of being done and you're looking for some major outreach and public programming to promote this and really provide greater public education and access, you can apply for programming and outreach through our public humanities grant program. We do have a program within that is called Humanities Discussions currently. Sometimes that program title changes over the years. It's currently known as Humanities Discussions, and there are a number of filmmakers who have applied and received funding for that public reach piece, the public programs piece, to really roll out the film.
Thank you.
Okay.
Should we take one more?
Yeah, I think, yeah, but let me see if I can find good connecting with scholars. Let's see. Here's a question here, and this is kind of a complicated one, so bear with me. It's about letters of commitment and distribution and the overarching institution for clout, essentially. Can a distribution plan involve submitting a letter of commitment from an academic institution's office that is in charge of management or dissemination, distribution of creative work completed by faculty? So I guess this would be a filmmaker or a project director who's based at a university. So the question goes on, since some corporations for online streaming services require that projects be proposed by an established organization and not by the individual filmmakers, how would that work? I guess it also kind of goes back to that fiscal sponsor question too.
The fiscal sponsor, we're not necessarily looking for an organization with a successful track record of distribution as the fiscal sponsor. We're looking for an organization that can manage funds well and ultimately work with you to manage the project well. So universities have received grants from us, from our division. Endowment-wide universities receive many grants, so they could certainly be an eligible fiscal sponsor, but letters of commitment are a little bit different in that they're from scholars or in some cases media production people on the project. And they're showing that they're interested in working with you on the project, that they have the experience to work with you on the project, that they'll be available. And, I mean, I think those are the main components. So I'm not sure if that answers that. It sounds like it's as much about an eligibility question, and are universities eligible to apply? And the answer is yes, as it is about the letters. But hopefully that addresses that.
Okay. We'll have, I think that's about all the time we have for the questions. So we do have a record of them here. And for those that seem like they may be pertinent, we can do our best to try to respond by email to those.
Yeah, well, and feel free to contact us if we can help with anything. And thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.